The Republic of Yemen is 36 years old. The buildings inside it are not. In a valley in the eastern desert, 500 towers rise from the earth. They are not steel, they are not concrete, they are mud. Sun-dried bricks stacked 5, 7, 11 stories high. Some have stood since the 3rd century, others were rebuilt in the 1500s. All of them are still inhabited. Shibam is older than every skyscraper in New York by more than 1,400 years. It is older than the nation that contains it by more than 17 centuries. Yemen unified in 1990, one of the youngest republics in the modern world. But the civilization beneath it stretches back more than 3,000 years. 6 ancient kingdoms, the Queen of Sheba, a dam that irrigated 25,000 acres for a millennium, a port that gave the world the word mocha, 103 mosques built before the 11th century, 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and today, 22 million people in need of humanitarian aid. How does one of the oldest civilizations on the Arabian Peninsula become one of the youngest nations on Earth? And what, if anything, survives the distance between those two identities? The answer begins not with the war everyone knows, but with a name almost no one remembers: Arabia Felix. The Romans called it that: fortunate Arabia, happy Arabia. The ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy used the term eudaimon Arabia, the blessed corner of a peninsula they otherwise considered barren and hostile. And they were not being generous, they were being accurate. Yemen was, for more than 2,000 years, the wealthiest territory on the Arabian Peninsula. Not because of oil. Oil would not matter for another 2 millennia. Because of trees, frankincense and myrrh. 2 resins so valuable in the ancient world that they appear alongside gold in the Christian nativity story. They grew almost exclusively in the mountains and wadis of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. And the people who controlled their harvest, their transport, and their sale to Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, and Persia were the kingdoms of what is now Yemen. Between the 8th century BCE and the 6th century CE, 6 rival states dominated this trade: Ma'in, Kataban, Hadramaut, Ausan, Himyar, and the most powerful of all, Saba, the kingdom of Sheba. Its capital was Marib, a city in a desert valley, 135 kilometers east of modern Sana'a. And what the Sabaeans built there was not a mud village clinging to survival. It was a civilization that bent the desert to its will. The Marib Dam, constructed around 700 BCE, it was one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world. A massive earthwork of carved stone, gypsum mortar, and copper reinforcing rods built across Wadi Dana at the point where seasonal monsoon floods emerged from the highlands. 2 enormous sluice gates, north and south, channeled water into a dispersive irrigation network that turned 10,000 hectares of desert into farmland. 25,000 acres, fed by a dam that predates the Roman Colosseum by 7 centuries. The system was not simple diversion. It captured the alluvial sediment carried by floodwater and converted it into fertile soil over generations. The dam did not just water the land, it created the land, and it sustained the Sabaean capital for more than 1,000 years. Inscriptions carved in the Sabaean Musnad script record its maintenance in extraordinary detail. One describes repairs requiring 20,000 men and more than 14,000 camels. Another records a breach in 454 CE and the mobilization to seal it. But maintenance requires political stability, and by the 6th century, that stability was gone. The Himyarites had absorbed the Sabaean kingdom by 275 CE. Power shifted, resources dwindled, and sometime between the mid-6th century and the death of Muhammad in 632, the Marib Dam collapsed for the final time. The Quran records it. Surah 34, verse 16. It describes the flooding of Saba as divine punishment, the consequence of a people who rejected God's blessings. Whether one reads it as theology or history, the facts beneath it are concrete. The dam's failure triggered the migration of up to 50,000 people. Entire clans scattered across the peninsula. Some scholars believe the founding tribes of what would become the United Arab Emirates trace their origin to this single event. Families who walked away from Marib because the water stopped. Today, a modern dam stands near the ancient site. Built in the 1980s by the Turkish firm Doğuş Group, financed by Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of the UAE, whose own tribe, by some accounts, resettled from Marib centuries earlier. The opening ceremony was held on December 20th, 1986, a ruler returning resources to the land his ancestors left. In 2015, the ancient sluice towers of the original Marib Dam were damaged in an airstrike. The 23-foot northern tower, built of limestone blocks bearing Sabaean and Himyarite inscriptions reused from even older structures, was struck during fighting between Houthi forces and the Saudi-led coalition. Some of those inscriptions had survived for more than 2,000 years. The Damar Regional Museum, a repository for over 150 ancient South Arabian inscriptions, including the oldest known texts from the Yemeni highlands, was destroyed entirely in a separate strike the same year. There is no backup archive. But Marib is not where this story stays, because the Sabaeans were not the only builders, and mud was not the only material. To understand what Yemen actually built and what still stands, you have to go higher. Sana'a sits in a mountain valley at 2,200 meters. It is one of the highest capital cities in the world, and it is one of the oldest, continuously inhabited cities anywhere. The name itself comes from the Sabaic word Masna'a. It means fortified place. The old city of Sana'a is not a ruin. It is not an archaeological site. It is a living neighborhood of more than 60,000 people, built inside walls that stand 9 to 14 meters high, containing over 6,500 houses, nearly all of them constructed before the 11th century. 103 mosques, 14 hammams, narrow streets threaded between towers that rise 6, 7, 8 stories above stone-built ground floors. Each upper level is lighter than the one below it, rammed earth and burnt brick replacing stone, decorated with geometric patterns of white gypsum that catch the afternoon light like lace. The Great Mosque of Sana'a is said to have been constructed while the Prophet Muhammad was still alive. Whether or not that tradition is literal, the structure dates to the earliest decades of Islam. Its courtyard has been walked for 14 centuries. And then there is Gumdan Palace, or what remains of it. Historical accounts describe a 20-story structure, a tower of stone and alabaster with windows of translucent marble and a roof made of a single slab that by some sources was so thin that a person standing beneath it could see the silhouette of birds passing overhead. If those accounts are accurate, Gumdan was the world's first skyscraper. Not Shibam, not Manhattan, a pre-Islamic palace in the highlands of Yemen. Most of it is gone now. What survives are fragments, and the knowledge that this city once produced architecture ambitious enough to be called impossible. UNESCO inscribed the old city of Sana'a in 1986. In 2015, it was added to the list of World Heritage in Danger after Saudi-led coalition airstrikes destroyed historic houses in the city center. The Al-Qasimi neighborhood sustained particularly severe damage. The 12th century Al-Mahdi Mosque was hit. The colored glass fanlights and carved wooden doors that defined the city's domestic architecture shattered across entire blocks. And the body responsible for preserving Sana'a's heritage, the General Organization for the Preservation of the Historic Cities of Yemen, operates on a capital budget that does not exceed 260,000 Yemeni rials per month. At current exchange rates, that is less than $400. Heavy rains in recent years have caused the collapse of approximately 1,000 houses in the old city. The preservation body has no contact with UNESCO. The Social Fund for Development covers salaries for 117 employees and 40 contractors, but official wages across Yemen's public sector have been largely suspended since mid-2016. The city endures, not because of institutions, because individual families continue to replaster their own walls, repair their own foundations, and keep the patterns intact with their own hands. The gypsum comes from the same mountains. The techniques have not changed in centuries. This is not preservation by policy, it is persistence by habit. "15 kilometers north of Sana'a, a road drops into Wadi Dar, a lush valley cut into the plateau. And rising from the center of it, on a natural spire of sandstone, stands a building that looks like it grew from the rock itself. Dar al-Hajar, the Rock Palace. 5 stories of mud and stone built directly into the pinnacle. Its windows are framed in carved gypsum. Its fanlights glow with colored glass, red, blue, amber, casting fractured light into rooms that once served as the summer retreat of Imam Yahya in the 1930s. The palace is not ancient, but its vocabulary is. Every decorative element draws from the same architectural language spoken across Yemen for centuries. A language that transforms functional buildings into something closer to calligraphy. But the Rock Palace is a postcard. The real architectural story of Yemen's highlands lives not in palaces, but in the terraces. West of Sana'a, the Sarawat Mountains, the highest range on the Arabian Peninsula, reach altitudes above 3,300 meters. Jabal an-Nabi Shuaib, at 3,666 meters, is the highest point on the entire peninsula. It is in Yemen. For more than 2,000 years, the steep western flanks of these mountains have been terraced. Stone walls stacked into the volcanic slope, creating narrow shelves of cultivable land that staircase down toward the Red Sea coast. The terraces catch monsoon rainfall that would otherwise sheet off the bare rock. They hold soil in place against gravity. They create microclimates, warm at the base, cool at the top, that support different crops at different altitudes. Wheat and barley in the higher reaches, sorghum lower down, and coffee, always coffee, on the terraces between 1,500 and 2,500 meters, where the moisture and the altitude produce the slow ripening cherries that give Yemeni beans their complexity. These are not ruins. Farmers still work these terraces by hand. The walls still need rebuilding after every rainy season. The land has not been mechanized because the slopes will not permit it. A tractor cannot operate on a gradient that steep, so the work continues as it has for millennia, stone by stone, season by season. Below the mountains, the land flattens into the Tihama, a narrow, humid coastal plain along the Red Sea. The culture here is different from the highlands. The proximity to Africa, just 30 kilometers across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at its narrowest point, has produced a population with visible East African heritage. The food reflects Ottoman and African influences more than the highland Yemeni cuisine. The architecture shifts from tower houses to lower, broader structures built for ventilation in the oppressive coastal heat. The Bab el-Mandeb itself, the Gate of Tears, is one of the most strategic waterways on Earth. Every ship passing between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean must transit this narrow strait. Approximately 12% of global trade passes through it. It is the reason Yemen has never been left alone by empires, and the reason the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping since late 2023 drew immediate military responses from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel. Yemen's geography has always been both its blessing and its curse. The mountains gave it rain, coffee, and natural fortification. The strait gave it strategic importance that attracted every power from Rome to Riyadh. And the desert interior, the western edge of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest sand desert on Earth, gave it isolation so complete that some valleys remained unmapped until the 20th century. And that architectural language, the vertical instinct, the decorated facades, did not stay in Yemen. From the valley of Hadhrami, the great Wadi system in Yemen's east, families carried it across the Indian Ocean. The Hadhrami diaspora is one of the most significant but least known migrations in modern history. Traders, scholars, and settlers left the valley for centuries, traveling to Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, India, and the Swahili coast of East Africa. They carried with them Islam, commerce, and a tradition of building that left visible marks thousands of kilometers from home. In parts of Java and the Malay Peninsula, you can find buildings that echo Hadhrami architecture, tower-like proportions, decorative plasterwork, and the same instinct to build upward in tight spaces that defines Shibam. Tarim, 20 kilometers east of Shibam in the same valley, demonstrates what happens when a building tradition absorbs wealth from abroad. Hadhrami traders who made fortunes in Southeast Asia sent money home. The mosques they funded are among the most beautiful in Yemen. 365 of them, by local count, one for each day of the year. And the Al-Mufdah Mosque rises from the center of the town with a minaret that reaches more than 50 meters, the tallest mud brick minaret anywhere on Earth. It was built in the early 20th century using the same sun-dried bricks that built Shibam, but shaped into a soaring, fluted tower that would not look out of place in a much larger city. The Hadhrami connection to Indonesia was so deep that when independence movements swept Southeast Asia in the 20th century, Yemeni families were already embedded in the social fabric. Some became political leaders. Others built schools and mosques that still stand from Surabaya to Singapore. The architecture they brought was not a copy of Hadramaut. It was a translation. The proportions changed, the materials adapted, but the vertical instinct, the decorated facades, the rooms that rise from storage at the base to gathering at the top, that grammar survived the crossing. And there is a quieter disappearance that Yemen has already endured. For more than 2,000 years, a Jewish community lived in Yemen. They predated Islam. Some traditions claim they arrived after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Others place their origin even earlier. What is documented is that by the medieval period, Yemeni Jews had developed a distinct culture, their own liturgical traditions, their own style of silverwork, their own dialect of Judeo-Arabic, and their own architectural mark on Sana'a. The Jewish quarter of Old Sana'a, Kar al-Yahud, had its own character. The buildings were shorter than the rest of the city, with larger floor plans, and the main gathering room elevated to the top floor, rather than distributed through the middle stories. The quarter had its own rhythm, its own economics, its own calendar, running parallel to the Islamic one. The community survived conquest after conquest, Ottoman rule, civil war, revolution. But beginning in 1949, Operation Magic Carpet airlifted approximately 49,000 Yemeni Jews to the newly established State of Israel. The exodus continued in waves. By 2020, fewer than a handful remained, the last members of a community that had lived in Yemen for over 2 millennia, outlasting the Sabaeans, the Himyarites, the Ottomans, and the Imams, only to vanish in the span of a single generation. Their silverwork survives in museums. Their synagogues have been converted to other uses. The Judeo-Arabic they spoke is nearly extinct. Some forms of persistence end not with destruction, but with departure. South and east, the land drops to the sea. Aden sits on the rim of an ancient volcanic crater, its harbour one of the deepest natural ports in the world. The British took it in 1839 and held it for 128 years. Their departure in 1967 created the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the only Marxist state in the Arab world. Its colonial architecture still lines the crater district, fading, salt-worn, slowly collapsing into itself. The word youngest in the title is not metaphor. Yemen's existence as a single nation is a matter of recent memory. For most of its modern history, there were two Yemens. The north, the Yemen Arab Republic, formerly an Ottoman province, then a Zaydi Shia kingdom, with its capital in Sana'a. And the south, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, a former British colony that became the only Marxist state in the Arab world after independence in 1967. They spoke the same language. They shared the same ancient heritage. But for decades, they were governed by entirely different systems, aligned with opposing sides of the Cold War. Unification came on May 22, 1990. a single Republic of Yemen, with Sana'a as the political capital and Aden as the economic center. The agreement looked, for a moment, like a resolution. It was not. Within 4 years, the South attempted to secede. A civil war in 1994 ended with northern forces capturing Aden. The country stayed unified, but the grievances that produced the split never disappeared. The Southern Transitional Council's attempted seizure of eastern Yemen in December 2025 was not an anomaly. It was the same fracture, reopened. The youngest nation on the peninsula has spent much of its short life trying to hold itself together. A country whose borders were drawn not by geography or culture, but by the departure of empires that never asked anyone's permission. And beyond Aden, far beyond, 380 kilometers south of the Arabian Peninsula and 240 east of the Horn of Africa, sits an island that belongs to Yemen, but looks like it belongs to another planet. Socotra. UNESCO inscribed the Socotra archipelago as a World Heritage Site in 2008, not for its architecture, but for its biology. A third of its plant species are found nowhere else on Earth. Its isolation, geological, not just geographical, separated it from the Arabian mainland millions of years ago, and evolution has been working in private ever since. The dragon's blood tree is the island's most recognizable species, Dracaena cinnabari. It looks less like a tree and more like an umbrella turned inside out, a dense canopy of dark green spreading from a single thick trunk, casting shade over a landscape of bare limestone and white sand. Cut the bark and it bleeds crimson. The resin, dragon's blood, has been harvested for millennia. Ancient Romans used it as a dye. Medieval Europeans ground it into varnish. Yemeni healers prescribed it for wounds. Beside the dragon's blood tree grows the cucumber tree, Dendrosychius socotranus, the only tree-sized member of the cucumber family on Earth. Its swollen trunk stores water against the dry season, and its canopy of broad leaves seems too lush for the arid rock it grows from. 10 bird species are endemic to Socotra: the Socotra buzzard, the Socotra scops owl, the Socotra sunbird, which produces long bursts of melody that echo off the limestone cliffs, feeding on spiders and cicadas between songs. Socotra's fauna is as strange as its flora. The island supports no native land mammals. Its isolation occurred before any could cross. Instead, the ecological niches are filled by reptiles and birds. The Socotra chameleon moves through the dragon's blood canopy. Geckos of the genus Hemodracon, found nowhere else, hunt insects on the limestone karst. The island's freshwater crab, endemic to its few streams, has adapted to seasonal drought by burrowing into wet sand and waiting. And overhead, the Socotra buzzard circles, a medium-sized raptor endemic to the island, vulnerable to extinction and visible only here. It shares the sky with the Socotra scops owl, which calls from the cliff faces at dusk in a voice that carries across the plateaus like a question repeated but never answered. And then there are the people. The Mara of Socotra speak Socotri, a language that is not Arabic. It is a descendant of the ancient South Arabian languages, the same family that produced the Sabaean Musnad script carved into the temples of Marib 3,000 years ago. Most of these languages are extinct. Socotri survives, primarily oral, passed between generations on an island that time has partially forgotten. It may be the last living thread connecting modern Yemen to its pre-Islamic voice. But Socotra's isolation has become complicated. During the Civil War, the UAE established a military presence on the island. Emirati flags appeared on government buildings. Separatist sentiment grew. The island's future, like Yemen's, remains contested. Back on the mainland, the land rises again. West of Sana'a, the Hadhrami Mountains climb through terraced slopes so steep that farmers have carved steps into the volcanic rock for centuries. And on those terraces, at altitudes where the monsoon rains still fall, grows a plant that changed the world more than frankincense ever did: coffee. Yemen is where coffee became a drink. The plant may have originated in the highlands of Ethiopia. The legend of Khaldi and his dancing goats persists, but the earliest written evidence of coffee cultivation comes from 12th century Yemen. By the 1400s, Sufi monks in the Yemeni highlands were roasting, grinding, and brewing the beans to stay awake for midnight prayers. They called it kahwa, the same Arabic word for wine, and like wine, it was alternately embraced and banned by religious authorities who could not decide whether it was a gift or a temptation. What they could agree on was its value. And for 150 years, Yemen held a global monopoly on coffee. Every bean in the world passed through a single port on the Red Sea, Al-Makka. Mocha, a small fishing village before the Ottomans arrived in 1538, Mocha became one of the most important trading ports in the world by the 17th century. English, Dutch, and French companies maintained permanent trading posts there. Ships crowded its harbor, sails from 4 continents waiting to load sacks of dark, aromatic beans grown in the highlands above. The Ottomans and Yemeni rulers guarded their monopoly fiercely. Beans were reportedly roasted or boiled before export to prevent germination. Fines were imposed on anyone caught smuggling live seeds. It did not last. Dutch traders eventually smuggled live plants to their colony on Java. The French carried seedlings to their Caribbean territories. Within a few generations, coffee grew on every continent. Mocha's monopoly dissolved. Its population fell from 20,000 to roughly 1,000 by the 1930s. Today, it is a village of ruins and a small fishing fleet, approached through silted-up channels. But the word survived. Mocha entered every European language as a synonym for fine coffee. The mocha pot is named for this town. And the reason your cafe mocha contains chocolate is because 17th century Europeans tasted Yemeni coffee's dark, complex flavor and reached for the only comparison they had: cocoa. 90% of the world's coffee can be genetically traced to Yemen. The beans in your cup carry a Yemeni passport. In 2013, a young Yemeni American named Mokhtar Al-Kanshali walked into a specialty coffee shop in San Francisco and tasted single-origin coffee for the first time. He had grown up in the Tenderloin, the child of immigrants from the mountain town of Ib. He had picked coffee cherries with his grandmother as a boy. He had never connected those memories to the cup in his hand. That moment sent him to Yemen. He traveled to the highland farms, worked with growers, and began sourcing specialty beans to bring back to the United States. Then, the Civil War erupted. In 2015, Trapped in a country under bombardment, Al-Kanshali made his way to the coast with 2 suitcases of coffee samples. He hired a fisherman at the port of Mocha, the same port that had once supplied the world, and crossed the Red Sea in a small boat with no radio and no navigation instruments. 7 hours later, he reached Djibouti. His coffee scored a 97 from Coffee Review. He founded a company called Port of Mocha. The logo is a boat. It is a story almost too precise to be real. A man escaping war through the same harbor that once exported the world's most valuable commodity, carrying the same product in his hands. The port that gave coffee its name, giving it one more chance. There is one more element of daily life in Yemen that shapes its landscape, its economy, and its afternoons, and it is not coffee. Kat, Catha edulis, a flowering plant whose young leaves, when chewed, release a mild stimulant, cathinone, that produces alertness, suppresses appetite, and loosens conversation. In Yemen, kat is not a drug in the way outsiders understand the word. It is a social institution. Every afternoon across the country, men and increasingly women gather for the magyal, the daily chewing session. They sit on cushions in a mafraj, the topmost room of a tower house, the one with the best light and the widest windows. And they chew for hours. The leaves are picked fresh that morning. They are held in the cheek, building into a green bolus that slowly releases its chemistry over the course of the afternoon. Business deals are made during kat sessions. Political alliances are formed. Disputes are mediated. The Magyal is where Yemeni society does its informal governance, the space between the official and the personal, where trust is built one afternoon at a time. But kat has a cost. The plant requires significant water to cultivate, and in a country facing severe water scarcity, kat farming consumes an estimated 40% of Yemen's irrigated water supply. Sana'a is one of the cities most at risk of running out of groundwater entirely. Some projections suggest the aquifer could be depleted within a generation. And yet, the economic incentive to grow kat remains overwhelming. A farmer earns more from kat than from any food crop. In a country where 80% of the population lives below the poverty line, that calculation is not abstract. The terraces that once grew coffee now increasingly grow kat. The plant that caffeinated the world is being displaced by the plant that sedates the afternoon. But coffee is not what the title promised. The title promised skyscrapers, and this documentary has been circling them, approaching from Sana'a's towers, from Marib's engineering, from the Hadhrami diaspora's building instinct. Because the story of Yemen's mud brick high-rises is not just architectural. It is the story of a civilization that decided, more than 17 centuries ago, that the safest way to live in a hostile landscape was to build upward. And nowhere is that decision more visible than in Shibam. The Hadramaut Valley runs roughly east to west through Yemen's interior. 160 kilometers of wadi, a dry riverbed that fills with seasonal floods, cutting through desert plateau in a canyon of orange and brown. Along its length sit 3 towns that together represent one of the densest concentrations of mud brick architecture on Earth. Seyun, with its whitewashed palace, now a museum. Tarim, home to 365 mosques, and the tallest mud brick minaret in the world, the Al-Mudar Mosque, rising more than 50 meters from the valley floor. And Shibam. The first thing you see is the wall, a fortification of sun-dried mud encircling a tight cluster of towers on a rocky spur above the wadi floor. From a distance, the effect is almost geological, as though the buildings are an extension of the plateau itself, carved rather than constructed. Up close, the scale becomes clear. 500 tower houses, some rising 11 stories, built entirely of mud brick on stone foundations. No steel reinforcement, no concrete, no mortar, beyond mud mixed with straw and left to cure in the sun. Shibam was founded around the 3rd century, when the pre-Islamic capital of Shabwa was destroyed in 300 CE. The seat of the Hadhrami kingdom moved here. The city sat on the ancient spice and incense route, a caravan stop between the frankincense groves of Dhofar and the markets of the Mediterranean. Its position on a raised spur protected it from the floods that periodically swept the wadi floor. Its elevation gave defenders a clear view in every direction. But the floods came anyway. In 1532, a devastating flood swept through the valley and crippled the foundations of the older towers. Much of the city had to be rebuilt. The buildings that stand today are largely products of that reconstruction. 16th century engineering responding to a catastrophe, using the same materials and the same instincts that had worked for 12 centuries before. The engineering is not primitive, it is precise. The bricks used in Shibam's towers decrease in size on each ascending floor. The walls grow thinner as the structure rises, creating a subtle trapezoidal profile, wider at the base, narrower at the top. This is not aesthetic, it is structural. The tapering reduces the load on the lower floors and shifts the building's center of gravity downward, increasing stability against wind and seismic movement. Each building is typically occupied by a single family. The ground floor is reserved for livestock and grain storage. The second floor often serves additional storage. Living quarters begin on the 3rd floor. The topmost rooms, the most private, the most elevated, the ones that catch the breeze, are where families gather. Wooden shutters and carved lattice screens filter light and air. The windows widen as the floors rise, reflecting a simple logic: security at the base, openness at the top. The narrow streets between buildings are paved with stone and winding. Goats wander them in the late afternoon. Children play in the shade between walls so close together that the alleyways function as natural wind tunnels, cooling the interiors below. And the city breathes through its relationship with the land around it. The wadi floor outside the walls is farmed. Crops are planted when the seasonal floods deposit moisture and sediment. After harvest, the soil itself is collected, mixed with straw and water, shaped into bricks, and left to dry. The same earth that feeds the people becomes the material that houses them. When the towers erode, and they always erode because mud is not permanent, fresh bricks are made from the next harvest's soil. It is a closed system, food and shelter from the same ground. A city that literally consumes and rebuilds itself in an annual cycle that has continued without interruption for 500 years. Freya Stark saw it in the 1930s. The British explorer, one of the first Western women to travel through southern Arabia, arrived in the Hadramaut and called Shibam the Manhattan of the desert. The name stuck. UNESCO inscribed it in 1982. In 2008, A tropical cyclone drove floodwater into the wadi at volumes the spur could not fully deflect. The foundations of multiple towers were compromised. Some collapsed. In 2009, a suicide bomber detonated at the sunset viewpoint overlooking the city, the spot where visitors gathered to watch the towers catch the last light. 4 South Korean tourists and their Yemeni guide were killed. In 2015, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula attempted to take Shibam itself. A car bomb was detonated at a checkpoint at the edge of the city. That same year, UNESCO added Shibam to its list of World Heritage in Danger alongside Old Sana'a. The towers still stand, most of them. Their walls still receive fresh coats of mud after every harvest. Families still live on the upper floors, still light oil lamps behind latticed windows, still hear the Maghrib call to prayer echo off 500 facades as the sun drops below the wadi rim. But the system that sustains them, the farming, the brick-making, the generational knowledge of which walls need replastering and when, depends on people. And the war has displaced 4.5 million of them. In the Western Highlands, the Hamadryas baboon still moves through the juniper woodlands in troops of 20 or 30, one of the largest wild mammals remaining in Yemen. Ancient Egyptians considered them sacred, representations of Thoth, the god of wisdom. In Yemen, they are simply present, picking through the terraces at dawn, watching from the cliff tops, adapting to the shrinking forest as it gives way to cut plantations and conflict. And somewhere in the mountains near Wada, the Arabian leopard may still move through the dark. Fewer than 200 across the entire Arabian Peninsula, perhaps 70 in Yemen, though no one can confirm it. The last camera trap image was more than a decade ago. The Horf-protected area, near Yemen's border with Oman, contains the largest forest on the Arabian Peninsula. Arabian wolves, Nubian ibex, gazelles, striped hyenas, and possibly the last leopards. The forest endures because its remoteness has, so far, kept it beyond the reach of the war. Yemen's civil war is now in its 11th year. It began in 2014, when Houthi insurgents, a Zaydi Shia movement with ties to Iran, seized Sana'a. A Saudi-led coalition intervened in 2015 with an air campaign that has since carried out more than 25,000 airstrikes. The United Nations estimates that 377,000 people died between 2015 and early 2022. 60% of those deaths were not from bombs or bullets. They were from hunger, from disease, from the collapse of a healthcare system that no longer functions. In 2026, 22.3 million people require humanitarian assistance. That is approximately half the population. 18.3 million are acutely food insecure. 2.2 million children under 5 are malnourished. More than 450 health facilities faced closure in 2025 alone. In January 2025, the World Food Programme terminated the contracts of all 365 of its staff in Houthi-controlled northern Yemen, where 70% of the country's humanitarian needs are concentrated. The reason? The arbitrary detention of UN personnel and mounting operational restrictions. As of December 2025, 69 UN employees remained in Houthi detention. Yemen's 2025 humanitarian appeal was funded at 29%. The Arabian leopard, Yemen's national animal, is the smallest subspecies of leopard on Earth. Males weigh roughly 66 pounds. Fewer than 200 survive in the wild. The last confirmed photograph of one in Yemen was taken in 2011 in the Horf-protected area near the Omani border. Abdul Rahman al-Ariani was Yemen's Minister of Water and Environment. After joining wildlife expeditions with the Foundation for the Protection of the Arabian Leopard, he became so alarmed by the species' trajectory that he resigned his government post entirely to work on saving it full-time. A minister who quit power to protect a cat that most of his countrymen have never seen. In a country where 22 million people need food, that is not contradiction. That is a specific kind of faith. The belief that what survives in the margins still matters, even when the center is on fire. Yemen was called Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. The name was earned over 2 millennia of wealth, ingenuity, and architectural ambition that the modern world has largely forgotten. The dam at Marib irrigated a desert for 1,000 years. The port at Mocha caffeinated a planet. The towers of Sana'a and Shibam proved that mud, the most humble material on Earth, could be stacked to the sky and made to last. The Republic of Yemen is 36 years old. It was formed on May 22, 1990, by the merger of two states that had already fought each other and would fight again within 4 years. It is younger than most of the buildings inside its borders. It is younger than the coffee trade that bears its port's name. It is younger than the inscriptions still legible on the stones of the dam it could not protect. No one knows when this war will end. No one knows how many of the 6,500 houses in old Sana'a will still be standing when it does. No one knows whether the families of Shibam will still be mixing mud from the wadi floor into bricks, or whether the harvest will have stopped and the walls will have begun their slow return to the earth they came from. The buildings do not ask these questions. They just stand. The gypsum catches the light. The mud brick absorbs the rain and dries in the wind. A man on an upper floor picks up an oud and plays, and the sound carries down a narrow alley where it reaches no one but the goats and the silence and the stones. 500 towers, 1,700 years, 36 as a republic. The oldest skyscrapers on Earth in the world's youngest nation, waiting to see which lasts longer. Thank you for watching. If this documentary changed how you see Yemen, consider subscribing to Where on Earth. We'll see you in the next one.